Okay, so we're going to be talking today about ways in which we can improve metacognition and why we might want to work on that a bit. There's a lot of research that shows, well, metacognition, as I think everyone here knows, involves thinking about one's own thinking and learning. It's basically reflecting on your learning processes and becoming more aware of your learning processing. And one of the reasons why this is important is that there's a lot of research going back at least 40 or 50 years now that show that students who have higher levels of metacognition can be much more efficient at their learning. Um, and there's also this issue, which you probably heard of, the Dunning-Kruger effect. We had a lot of that showing up in various memes around the time of the prior election, that in general, that people who have low levels of competence, low levels of understanding, are less likely to understand that they are not very competent at a particular skill. The flip side of that is that as people become more proficient at something, they recognize better how much they don't know. And we'd like for students to be able to avoid that Dunning-Kruger effect. We'd like students to have a realistic understanding of what they know and what they don't know, because we want to prepare students for a lifetime where they'll be learning in the future. So in terms of learning strategies that students use, and this is an area where I think it would be helpful for students to understand better. We know that students in general tend to study by repeatedly reading things. And that repeated reading tends not to be particularly effective. After the second time reading something, there's virtually no significant increase in learning within a reasonable time period anyway. Students tend to do a lot of highlighting, and pretty much every study that's been done has shown that highlighting tends to be completely ineffective in helping students remember things. We did a reading group here on Make It Stick and Jim Lang's Small Teaching, where a lot of people came into the reading group sessions mentioning that they had highlighted the sections about the importance or the lack of value in highlighting, which they recognized was somewhat ironic. Students also tend to do a lot of cramming that they in general, sometimes that's because of the incentives we provide students and the way we structure our courses. And it's also because students, like all of us, tend to procrastinate and wait until the last minute to do things. And they also, this is related to cramming, they tend to do a lot of block practice where they'll focus their study on a particular topic until they believe they mastered it, and then go on to another topic until they believe they master it. But that tends not to be as effective as what's called interleave practice, when you mix things up a bit. And in general, the problem basically is that the strategies that students use are not particularly efficient in learning, which means students end up spending a lot of time that's wasted, that they could use their time more efficiently and learn more effectively and more deeply. And all of these things, though, particularly the repeated reading and highlighting, create a phenomenon called fluency illusion, which is you remember reading these things, you remember seeing the words on the page, and each time you read through it, it looks more and more familiar. But that increased familiarity does not necessarily imply a deeper understanding. And one of the problems basically is that students pretty much nowhere in their educational process have really been taught how to learn. They figured it out. They've gotten some advice from people along the way, perhaps their parents, perhaps their teachers in elementary and secondary schools, sometimes in college. But there's also been a lot of studies where teachers and college faculty have been tested or have been surveyed on what are the most effective study techniques. And the study techniques that faculty recommend tend to be pretty much the practices that students use, because those are the things that they learn themselves on their own as being strategies that work for them in some way, but they were never exposed to alternative practices, or very few people have been exposed to alternative practices. So one of the things we could do is we could try to redesign our courses to shift students in ways that will help them get a better understanding of what they know and what they don't know. One technique is peer instruction. When you have students explain things to each other, it will help them. Well, in general, there's a lot of research that shows that peer instruction can be more effective than working with faculty in terms of getting assistance or helping you understand things, because students can work with other students at a similar level of cognitive development, and that it's much easier to explain things to other people or to understand the explanations from people who just already learned it or have learned it recently. And the basic reason for that is, as faculty become, as people become faculty, they develop higher and higher levels of understanding, and it's harder and harder for faculty to understand what topics students have trouble with. I'm just going to mute there for a second. There's a little bit of background noise. Okay. And what happens basically is, when students explain things to each other, it tends to increase the amount that students learn. And that's been, again, shown in quite a few studies. I think I have references to a few of those in that document I shared. One of the most important things, and this is something we've known for over a century, is that the testing effect is one of the most effective way of learning. We tend not to call it the testing effect today because testing has gotten a somewhat bad reputation, but in general, retrieval practice is the name we tend to use for it today. But in many classes, particularly in STEM fields, low stakes tests or no stakes tests with some feedback can be really effective. No stakes tests work really well, but students often don't do it. Carol Twigg, who ran the National Center for Academic Transformation, has a phrase that she used to use in all of her workshops, which was, freshmen don't do optional. That when you give students the option of doing some practice quizzing, in general, the students who are going to do it tend to be the students who are going to be getting the A's anyway, or the students who are the B+ students who want to become A students, and so forth. The students who most need the practice tend to be the students who are least likely to do that. So low stakes testing tends to be more effective in practice, especially in introductory classes, unless you have very highly motivated students. And in general, students who struggle often find it easier to give up than to work through practice quizzes and so forth, because it can be frustrating. But providing some incentives, particularly if you do some type of mastery quizzing, for example, can be effective in moving forward. And polling is another technique that can be used to help students get that sort of practice. Even if you're teaching larger classes, it's a fairly effective technique. Mastery learning quizzes, where you give students banks of questions where they can take them as many times as they want with random drawings each time, can be really effective. And you can set them up generally in a learning management system, so only the highest grade is kept. And in general, one of the problems and one of the reasons why students don't do this on their own is that it's much easier to sit and listen to a lecture, and students tend to prefer that in most surveys, than it is to struggle to try to apply some concepts. But that struggle is what really tends to deepen learning and tends to create more long-term learning, and also a greater ability to take the concept you've learned and apply them in new circumstances. Bjork and Bjork refer to that as desirable difficulties. Vygotsky also talked about a similar concept. And basically the notion is, if something is too easy, students will get bored and not want to do it. If something is too challenging, they get frustrated and give up. So you want to find a level of difficulty that will challenge students without encouraging them to, well, without discouraging them, basically. And that can be a challenge, especially in a class where you have students with very diverse prior backgrounds. So to the extent to which we can set up a system that provides a challenge to all students, that can be helpful. One way of doing that is through, let me go back. One way of doing that, well, my keyboard's not working. One way of doing that is by using adaptive learning or personalized learning platforms, particularly in introductory classes, that already does this type of thing, where basically students will be given challenging problems, and the level of that will adjust, and the background and the resources provided will adjust to the students' prior learning, to what the students come in with, so that if they're able to do some things very well, they don't waste a lot of time on those topics. If they are struggling with things, it will automatically give them some lower level tasks to help them develop. That's not feasible in all classes, but again, in STEM classes, that can work pretty well. But we can also build in space practice into course design so that the students are given some tasks to do regularly, so that they don't only have those 3 exams and a final, or 2 exams and a final, or 2 or 3 major papers. Because again, students, like all of us, tend to procrastinate. But if you have some work done required every week, it forces students to space out their studying, which also encourages deeper learning. Interleave practice is when we mix up questions. And again, if we can build that into our courses, it can be much more helpful. The classic study on this was done probably about 25, 30 years or so ago, but there have been many since. But in that case, students were shown 4 10-minute videos on how to compute the volume of objects of different shapes. So there was a cylinder, there was a sphere, there was a prism, and there was a 4th object, which I don't remember right now. And in one case, they were shown the video, they were given 10 problems related to that. Then they went to the next type of shape, they were given 10 problems, and then they did that for all 4 shapes. And in general, when students had just been exposed to the video and they worked in that sort of block practice, they ended up doing very, very well immediately. So their average was something like a 90 or so in that initial experiment. In the other group, in the treatment group, the same videos were used, but students watched all 4 of them. And then they were given a mix of the same problems, but they were randomly mixed together. So students not only had to plug numbers into the formula they had just seen, they had to recall the formula and determine which formula was appropriate for which object. And in that case, students did quite a bit worse. I think their average score was somewhere around a 60 or so. But then both groups were tested a week later. And what happened was that the group that had the block practice, where they did everything clustered together, had forgotten virtually everything, that their scores were dramatically lower. The group that actually had the interleave practice ended up doing better a week later than they did when they were initially exposed to it. And that type of practice, where students have to determine not just what numbers to plug into what formula, but have to determine what model applies, can be really helpful in encouraging more learning. It's part of those desirable difficulties. The more the more students have to devote, the more effort, cognitive effort, students have to devote to applying concepts, the better they'll learn it. Because it's training the brain, basically, that these are things they need to know, they have to be able to recall them, and it makes it easier to recall things in the future. Because what the research shows basically is that repeatedly trying to store things in your brain is very ineffective. What really matters is that practice of retrieving and application. And the more you can encourage students to do that, the more likely they are to remember things. And I already mentioned adaptive or personalized learning tools that ask students to rate their confidence levels or on responses. For example, Norton has a system called InQuizitive, where students are asked questions and they get to bet points on the question, where essentially, if they're really comfortable with something, they can assign more points to it. If they don't know it as well, they assign less points because they're penalized for wrong answers. So essentially, it's encouraged them to think not just about what the best answer is, but to have them reflect on how well they know it. We also have an iClicker tool here on our campus where, as of about a year and a half ago, there's also the option of asking students to rate their confidence on how well they know something. And students, when they work through those problems, get immediate feedback, not just on whether or not they were correct, but also whether their expectations of whether they were correct or were justified or not. So students who thought they knew things really well can get very immediate feedback that encourages them perhaps to recognize that maybe they don't understand some things as well. Or alternatively, students who perhaps might be a little uncertain about their knowledge can get some positive feedback and help them develop a higher level of metacognition. Now, one of the things I've done is develop something with a colleague, a friend at Genesee Community College called the Metacognitive Cafe. Judy Littlejohn and I, we first started doing this about 9 or 10 years ago. And it's basically a low stakes discussion forum that we've used in our generally low, well, I've used it in 2 classes actually, an introductory microeconomics class and a labor economics class. And Judy used it in her history class, where students were basically encouraged to reflect on their learning and also to reflect on their learning practices a bit. Well, I'll just hop over here for a second and show you some of the learning prompt that I had used in this. And I've been using this for quite a few years, and it's at the end of the term, students have generally said that this is something that they wish they had learned earlier. So the very first one, I'm asking them a question about whether they've taken an online class before and reflecting on what's worked well and what hasn't worked well. And it leads to a really good discussion where students are sharing their experiences. And then normally some students will start saying that they are visual learners. And then normally the next topic will be to have them talk about learning styles and how learning styles are a bit of a myth, and how that perhaps might interfere with the learning. In both, generally by the third, each of these takes place for a week. By the third week or so of the class, students are being exposed to more graphs, more math, and they generally find it fairly challenging. So the next topic is to reflect on how they deal with challenging material. And one of the main purposes of this discussion is just to help students recognize that they're not alone. Because one of the things that happens, particularly in an asynchronous class, is if you're struggling with material, it's really easy to assume you're the only one struggling with it. And by putting this at the point in the class where that sort of struggle tends to occur pretty regularly, it lets everyone in the class recognize that they're all struggling with some of these concepts, and they can share some of the practices about what's worked well and so forth. And then, much of the rest is on things like retrieval practice, space practice, also commitment devices to help students get past some of the issues they may have with procrastination and how they perhaps can deal with that. Then there's a topic dealing with distractions and so forth, because most students believe they're much better at multitasking than they actually are, although I think there's been more recognition of that in recent years. And then, well, it goes on from there. You can take a look at it, but it's been something that's worked really, really well in my classes, at least. And I'm going to try to get back to the slides. And I have no idea why that's not opening. Let me see. I'm having some computer problems here, as I mentioned. And now I cannot even close this. Well, let me try something else. Sorry. The keyboard on this computer has completely stopped responding. I'm going to try opening the slides in another window and dragging them over. Okay. And that ability still seems to be there. And I've never seen this problem on this computer. And it doesn't seem to be even allowing me to open the slides.
John, would it be possible, since you put the slides in the chat?
Yes, could someone share their screen? That would be good if someone could share it. Sorry about that.
It's okay. This is Carlo. I'll share
Thanks, fellow.
my screen if that's okay. Let me get over here
There's
for a
not
second.
that many more slides, but
And you can just kind of walk me through and let me know when
sure.
I should advance them.
Okay, thank you. It was right on, I think it was like on the 4th or 5th slide there.
All right. Oops. Sorry, I'm getting a little click happy here.
Okay, so in any case, that metacognitive cafe has worked really well. And at the end of the class, students would often say that that was the most valuable thing they learned from the class, that they had never really been exposed to information about how they could learn more efficiently. And a lot of them will try techniques and share the results. And one of the nice thing about it all is it created a really nice sense of community because students got to know each other much more effectively when they were sharing their study practices, where they were sharing the struggles, where they were talking about what things worked for them, what supportive videos was useful, and so on. And it built a sense of class community that bled into the rest of the class, because I did have them work on content discussions where they were applying concepts they had just learned to issues in the world and so forth, or listening to a podcast and using theory that they had just learned to explain some of the situations. But they got to know each other because students would talk about the challenges they had, where some students were working, where they were raising young children, where they may have been working at a couple of jobs, and they would talk about their lives, and they would talk about their careers and their career aspirations, and that often showed up in the comments they made to each other in the regular discussions, because it did build this really strong sense of community. Okay, if you could go ahead to the next slide. There's other activities that are metacognitive exercises where you could do an exam or an activity wrapper, where after students take an exam or complete a paper or a project, ask students to reflect on how they prepared for that. Have them just write up a little note about how they prepared and also how they might want to prepare differently later. There's been a number of people who've suggested, Sandra McGuire, for example, suggests that one of the most effective times to help students think about these things is after the first test, when they thought they were doing pretty well, and then they get some feedback which suggests maybe they may not have learned things as well as they'd like. And that's a really teachable moment where if you can have students reflect on that and talk about what they want to do, you could have them write something up, you could even collect it, and then a few weeks later, before the next exam or the next major thing they have to do, send it back to them and saying, this is what you said you were going to do before this, just as a reminder. And if you could go ahead to the next, and again, a little bit more. Another thing you could do pretty regularly is a 1-minute quiz, also sometimes called an exit quiz. Oops, I did say 1-minute quiz there twice. Sorry about that. A 1-minute quiz given at the end. Sometimes it's called a muddiest point, which is probably what I meant to type the other time, where at the end of class, you ask students what they've learned that day. You ask them what they don't quite understand and what they'd like to learn more about in the future. And then you can start the next class doing that. There was a study done by an economist a few years ago who taught one class using this 1-minute quiz and one without it, and controlling for other student characteristics. And the students who had the 1-minute quiz did significantly better on the same final exam in the class than the students who did not. There have been other studies that have found mixed results. Some studies found a significant effect of using a 1-minute quiz. None found a negative effect. So it seems to help, but the results aren't as strong as some of the other things some other techniques that have been done. Another thing that people often will do is have students do reflective logs or a reflective blog, where students will reflect on their learning process, where they might just be sharing that with the instructor, or they might be sharing that publicly on a public blog where they describe their learning, or a class blog, which is limited to the class use, or a discussion forum where students will reflect on some of the questions, some of the things that they've been learning. Another thing that can be helpful is when some of the material you're working through is challenging, especially in a face-to-face or a synchronous class, is if you could model how you'd approach a problem and go through it from the beginning to end, asking students along the way what the next step should be, but just helping students learn the skills of your discipline in terms of how to approach a problem a bit, well, effectively, and how you would look at a problem if it's the first time you were seeing it. And just modeling that process and modeling the process step by step makes it a lot easier for students to learn how to do that themselves sometimes. Another thing is that low stakes discussion forum, like the metacognitive cafe, can be helpful. And I think there's maybe one more. No, okay. And the other thing there is a series of resources I put together on metacognition and learning. If you click on that, it's this is probably the most useful part of the presentation, I think. There's a lot of studies out there showing the first part is about some of the evidence about students' misperceptions and also faculty misperceptions about how we learn, because that's been a topic that's been studied quite a bit. The next set of topics is on the importance of students' metacognition on learning, to the extent to which metacognition seems to encourage more learning. And the last part, I think, well, not quite the last part, the penultimate section is on evidence-based research strategy, or research strategy, not research, research studies of various techniques of improving metacognition on student performance. And the last part is a series of links to other resource sites that are put together by various teaching centers or other organizations. And I think that's the last part of it. So, oh, and also a few podcasts that we have from our podcasts, including one where Judy our very second podcast, where Judy talked about the process where we developed the metacognitive cafe. It came out of a discussion we had where we had an informal, I think we had called it a cafe, where each of us had something where students could, in every module, just post questions for other students to answer. And it was virtually never used. So we said, well, could we do something that might be useful? And that's where we decided to put in some low stakes associated with it. In my classes, they were about 5% of the total course grade. And I think Judy was doing something very similar. And the other two podcasts were ones we did with Judy Betcher, who was one of the early researchers on teaching and learning, and Linda Nielsen, who, for anyone who's taken the AQ course, is one of the people who shows up on that AQ course all the time. And she has a book on self-regulated learning, as well as on, well, she has a number of books out there, including best practices in teaching. It's more of an encyclopedia than any of the others out there. But those are the resources. So any comments or thoughts or questions, if you could either turn your mics on or type something in chat.
So John, this is Carlo. As you were talking, the things that come to mind more recently for me is using Mentimeter.
Yes.
And I found it to be a wonderful tool for kind of those low stakes polling opportunities, checking for how students are feeling about learning. But I've also found that by using ChatGPT, for example, if I used to show a lot of snippets of videos and then do like a turn and talk sort of thing after the videos were shown, 5-minute YouTube video on developmental theorist or something. But it was always kind of hard to harness both the conversation and get some sense of how students were doing. So what I found is that by uploading the transcript of a YouTube video to ChatGPT and then working with it to get some general questions about what is being discussed in the videos and then putting those into some kind of poll, it's a really fun way to break things up a little bit. Students seem to like it. And the nice thing about Mentimeter is, depending if you get the paid version, you can do some deeper dives and look at errors and response rates. So I found it to be a really useful tool to tap into some of the things that you're discussing.
I've used Mentimeter and I do have a paid account, but but the problem is when I'm teaching a class, though my introductory class, it's generally, well, this year was only about 250 students, but it's normally between 300 and 400 students. And the cost of Mentimeter for a class at large is just prohibitive. But iClicker has many of the same, well, has some really good tools too. And that's what I tend to use in my large class. But one of the other things I've done is I've used something called, along the same lines as what you're talking about, is I use Play Pause It, which is a video overlay basically where I create videos, short tutorial videos, mostly 5 to 12 minutes or so, and you can embed questions right in the middle of it. So, ChatGPT wasn't available when I was creating these things, but basically, you find you have students talk about something, or you talk about something, then you give them an application question where they're checking their knowledge, checking their understanding, or predicting what the results of an experiment would be. And then they answer that, and then it moves on to the next stage. And some of those are just survey type questions. Some of them are graded questions, but they can go back and redo it as many times as they want. So it's basic. Again, that's another activity that's, I think, about 10% of the grade in my class, where they can basically go through until they master the material. And that's worked pretty well too. But, students do enjoy working with videos or even podcasts where you can do the same type of thing. Other thoughts or other strategies for improving student metacognition?
Well, it's Carlo again. John, I have a question in terms of low stake tests with feedback. I find it's a little easier in my in-person classes. What have you found useful for online, particularly like asynchronous classes? It's always been a struggle for me.
It's a bit more challenging now with all of the AI tools out there. I had created test banks that have become less and less useful over the years. All the questions that I had in there ended up first on the various academic integrity or violation sites out there, mostly Chegg. And then, so I rewrote all the questions, but now AI tools pretty much allow you to answer allows AI to answer all those things. So I have students do a bit more. I try to do more authentic assessments. In my online class, I've had students create podcasts where it's a scaffolded project where they try to where they have to apply some of the concepts to some topic in the news. They can still use AI tools for that, but at least they have to make some connections themselves to be able to do that meaningfully. So it's been a bit of a challenge. It's the sort of self-testing and mastery quizzing online is, unless you really can trust your students, and most students will be honest, but there are some who will not be, and that's a bit of a challenge. And I tried to use questions that are as vulnerable to AI responses, but I did have one where I asked students to reflect on some data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics in my labor class in the last 6 months or so, which was not available at the time in the training database. And the student submitted a response that said, as an AI tool, I do not have access to this data, but you can find the data there. So they directly copied the response without even reading it. So it's a challenge, and it makes it a lot more, well, to the extent to which you can shift students' focus from the grades to learning, and encourage them that they really, or show them why they need to learn these skills so that they have an incentive to do it, then they won't be quite as worried about that. And if you do set it up so that they can do things over and over again until they master it, it takes a lot of the pressure off, so they're less likely to engage in academic, integrity issues. But it's going to happen, and it's certainly a lot easier than it was a year ago. So, Doris.
I was going to say, I really appreciate all the resources and all the information. And I think one of the highlights for me is, oh yeah, the faculty misconceptions, which I know are there, but I really appreciate having documentation. I was going to say, when I taught at another university, and the majority of students were first generation. And one of the biggest hurdles was simply convincing them that practice was important and that practice benefited them. So it was like a regular conversation. And I found for myself what was useful is using other examples. So like I do a little like thing on, I'm a overweight old lady, but I learned to lift weights. And here's what I learned about lifting weights. You lift to a certain point and then you increase. But if you stay at the same level all the time, you won't improve, right? So stupid examples, playing the piano, whatever it is, so that students could connect to something that they cared about in their life, and that they do practice without thinking about it, and connect that to their learning. I was going to say in terms of tools, I really like the Moreau whiteboard. And one of the things that I would do is not ask specific questions from the reading, but ask them to think about the reading. Same sort of thing. Like, what was the most challenging thing? What do you want to know more about? What did you find surprising? And I would do it in Moreau and ask them to just put a one sentence on a Post-it note there. So it wasn't huge, but then read everyone else's and move them around. So your response was close to people who had similar questions or similar answers. So it became more, for me, for online, becomes a little more tactile and not as intimidating. I find students with online classes, so much of it is text, right? They're reading stuff, their interaction with other people is all through text. So I'm always looking for ways to like lighten that load, but give them chances to interact. But anyway, I really appreciate all of this. This was terrific.
Yeah, I try using some of the same types of things. I'll talk about, well, how did you learn how to play a sport? How did you learn to swim? How did you learn how to ride a bicycle? It wasn't by reading a book. It was by trying it and working through it and practicing. But that's not how they've generally been trained along the way, that they've been told just to reread things until they master it. And it's hard to break that habit, especially because it seems easier. It seems like they're learning it, and then they get a test or an application that is a bit more challenging. And a common response is, well, the test was tricky. And you've got to prepare students to practice those things, to develop the skills so that they can recognize this isn't really tricky. This is an issue that you just haven't yet mastered. And giving them the opportunity to master that, though, is important. And that's one of the things that Jim Lang and some other people emphasize, that however we test students, we should have them practice. So if we're going to have them test them by writing essays, you need to give them practice writing essays. If you're going to test them with multiple choice quizzes, you should give them practice with that format, so that the first time they see that type of question or that way of approaching a problem isn't on a higher stakes activity. So. Other thoughts? And I am seriously missing Google's whiteboard. I wish they hadn't taken that away. That was so handy. But there's a lot of good whiteboard tools out there. Any other questions, comments, thoughts?
John, this is Carlo again. I teach a foundation in learning class for the CPS department, which dovetails so much with what we're talking about. What I found, though, is a lot of the conversations and thoughts that go into that class have branched out into every other class that I teach. So not only with respect to, what is learning, but when I talk to students about, do they prepare for a class to do well on the test, or do they prepare for the class in order to be able to teach somebody else what they've learned? And then we kind of unpack that. The vast majority of students will acknowledge that they're preparing for the class to do well to get a good grade. And when we reframe it and say, okay, now how would you behave differently if you were preparing for this class in order to teach it to somebody else? And that brings the conversation to a whole different level in terms of depth of understanding and rigor and willingness to struggle, as opposed to, well, there's 3 assignments I need to do this well on to get done with this class. So I found that kind of bringing that metacognitive conversation into everything can be helpful.
Definitely. And, that's one of the things in my large class I suggest that students do, that they not only prepare it to be able to explain it for someone else, but that's a great way of practicing, a great way of developing their understanding. That if they can explain the concept to someone else, they're going to do well on tests. So they don't really need to worry so much about the test. But, a really great way to try to test your own understanding is to try to explain it. And actually, Sandra McGuire was here a few years ago and gave a keynote talk. And one of the things she talked about was having, she had a student who didn't really socialize much with other people for whatever reason, but she said, that student had a goldfish. So she encouraged the student to explain everything she had learned that day to her goldfish. And it seems kind of silly, but it works, because if you can take the concepts you're learning and explain them to, well, an inanimate object or to someone else who doesn't understand it, you're going to have a much deeper understanding of it than if you just passively try to absorb things, or if you're just trying to remember things for a test. And I think we've all had that experience, that the first time we really got a really solid understanding of many of the things that we had learned was when we had to teach them to other people. And if we can encourage students to do that, that's really helpful. Any other comments or thoughts? Okay, well, thank you all for coming, and we'll see if we can get this computer back to work again. I'm not quite sure what happened here, so thank you. Oh, and tomorrow we have a keynote session, by the way. Try to be there if you can, with the authors of Grading for Growth at 9 o'clock tomorrow. So, who talk about other ways of shifting the focus of student learning to away from grades to a focus on learning. So they've got a really good book, and we're looking forward to their discussion tomorrow. Okay, thank you. Now, Maggie, we have a problem.
The keyboard's not working.
The keyboard is